Okay, there's lots of things to do today, but I've got a whole week I left on purpose for the critique of Descartes. It doesn't take that big a chunk of being in time, but it's the interesting moment where Heidegger and contemporary thinking about computers and artificial intelligence come together, and worth spelling out in more. But before I start that, I have to talk about something else. I wish there were more people here because they may be the very people who need to hear this. I'm worrying that the drop deadline is coming up September 28th, and that there may be some people in the course who really shouldn't be in the course because they haven't had the prerequisite of 25B, History of Modern, and haven't had at least something. Oh, this isn't a prerequisite, it's a good idea. Something, either Kant or Searle on philosophy, on his philosophy of mind. But I'll go on and talk about it now. If you have friends who this applies to, go tell your friends. What I want to warn you is there seem to be two illusions, according to my TAs, of people who justify being in the course even though they know they haven't got the prerequisites and the computer lets them in, and I'm not going to go check the record of everybody to see if they've had 25B, but these are misconceptions, namely, one, that Heidegger's against the philosophical tradition, so why should you need to know the philosophical tradition to read Heidegger? But Heidegger, you must realize, and it should become clearer today, defines his position against Descartes and against the whole history of modern philosophy for one thing, so you better know what he's against or you won't understand what he's for. And he uses a lot of the jargon of the very people he's against, like Kant's important talking of conditions of the possibility of experience and so forth. So if you haven't had the prerequisites in that, you don't think that you don't need them, because Heidegger is something, in a certain way, brand new, but you can't tell what it is if you don't know what he's coming from. That'll become a lot clearer today, why you need to know Descartes. Then another interesting one, but this is phenomenology, so you don't need experience with philosophy and philosophical terminology and philosophical arguments in order to appreciate it. There's some truth in that. Heidegger says you've got to start with the phenomenon, and I say, and he would say too, then you can go back and understand the text, and with the text you can understand the phenomenon. There's nothing particularly in there that says you ought to have 25B. This comes out only in your papers. If you want to get good grades on your papers, then you've got to understand how it isn't enough to just see the phenomenon and describe it. That might make a good paper. It might make a good novel like Heidegger's Nausea, but that's only existential. You have to actually find the philosophical point of it and explain it and criticize it or defend it, or you're going to get a low grade on your papers. And finally, that brings me to the fact that I'm not going to be lenient, and the TAs aren't going to be lenient in grading your papers. We're going to assume that these papers are written by people who have fulfilled the requirement of 25B, or else come and talk to me in office hours and explain to me why you don't need to know anything about the history of modern, or decide that you don't care whether you got a C on your paper or not. You're here for learning things, not for grades. However, if you care about your grades, don't come complaining to me or the TAs if you get bad grades on your papers because you haven't had the context that you need to understand this hard stuff. Now, one possibility is drop the course before September 28th. The other possibility is switch to pass, not pass. Then even if you get C on your paper, you will pass, and it won't mess up your grade point average. Any comments about this? This is a very important issue for me, because I don't really want people to get in trouble. And every year there are people who think they can just take it without the prerequisites and get in trouble. Okay, well, for you out there in the podcast world, I hope you heard this too, and all the more if you don't come to lectures and sort of actually engage in the discussion, that's going to cause a lot of problems too with a hard text like this. So I hope to see everybody here, if possible, and everybody here, and those who I see here, I hope that they have the prerequisites. Okay, that speech is now finished. So next, so I wash my hands of it, in other words. I've overcome any guilt about what happens to you after this. So now, then I want to spend some time before we get to Descartes on something which is so exciting to me, because I've taught this so often that I less and less find out that I've really made a mistake or put something very unclearly that can be said more clearly, and get a chance to think through something new. But I think I can say a lot better than I said in my lecture about something about the relation of the for the sake of which at the end of the chain of in order tos. There's a whole clear story to be told. And Heidegger's not very clear about it, and I certainly didn't see the moment in which he sort of makes the important distinction. My mistake was to treat the whole thing of I'm using the chalk in order to write on the board, in order to finally, for the sake of teaching this course, for instance, I could have said. That's one kind of for the sake of which. And that for the sake of which is something I can achieve, and it'll be done by the end of the semester. But all of that for what Heidegger calls primary for the sake of which, of my understanding myself as a teacher. I didn't distinguish the two for the sake of which is clear enough. And the fact that, in a certain way, the first one is kind of ontic for the sake of which. It's about particular relations. I'll explain that more in a minute. But then there is, I think, a difference between an ontic and an ontological for the sake of which, and they aren't even in the same dimension. It isn't as if the ultimate for the sake of which is just one more step after the more relative for the sake of which. It isn't somehow I teach the course in order to get you to understand Heidegger, let's say, and I do that in order to be a teacher. Because getting you to understand Heidegger, it's easier if I say teaching philosophy 185 and accomplishing that is something in the future which I'll do, I hope. And then there's this broader thing where I'm being a teacher when I do it, and you're being a student when you do it. That's not another step. That's a different level of description. Now, I said it there. Now I'm going to read it the way I wrote it. And I'm going to hand out, I'm going to use this, I just want to tell you, I'm going to be quoting some long quotations from other places than Being in Time, and I'm going to hand them all out to you and put them on the website. And at the same time, I'll put the notes of what I'm going to about say on the website, because they're new to me, and they've got a whole sort of structure that I would like to emphasize. Maybe you can write it in your notes in a structure. Think of two columns. And one of the columns you can say referential totality, and the other one is significance. I'd write all this on the board if my writing wasn't so bad and dyslexic that it would take more time to fix it than to write it. But so there are two columns, referential totality and significance. Now, the referential totality, just listen to this now, has two purposes, and they're both for the sake of. There's the whole structure of in order to leads up to the, now it goes in the referential totality column, leads up to the for the sake of some basic interest of Dasein. And on the other hand, there is also the whole activity of coping with the referential totality leads up to a way that a Dasein takes a stand on its being. Now I have to spell that out more. So let's look now. All this is on 116 in very condensed form. This all started because the TAs were sort of, the graduate students were sort of challenging me to try to understand better and clearer the distinction between significance and referential totality, which I think Heidegger does not explain very well. and I was looking afterwards this morning for some nice, clear place where he does explain it. It's sort of running around on page 116, but it's never sort of nailed or hammered, let's say. So here we go. So there is something first in the middle, roughly, of 116. In the German, we're on the top of 184, the middle of 184. Sorry, not 184, 84. So we're on 116. And on the left-hand side, with hammering, I'm just reviewing now, there is an involvement in making something fast. With making something fast. With making something fast, there is an involvement in protection against bad weather. And this protection is for the sake of providing shelter for Dasein. That is, for the sake of a possibility of Dasein's being. That's the crucial phrase. That's an Willen in German, a for the sake of. Now, at the very bottom of the page, it turns out that there's something else, the primary towards which is a for the sake of which, and the footnote says, that's a Worum Willen. So really, there's no big deal difference in the German. One of them just says the for which, or for the sake of, and the other one seems to say for the sake of which. But there's a big deal in what Heidegger's trying to do. So the first one is, I'm going to call it now, put it into the column of referential totality. It's the pragmatic side of Heidegger. And that means the following, that the whole structure of in order to's leads to, as I said, for the sake of a basic interest in Dasein's, which is now we know this Willen, and this case the example is, and you could put it on that column, a shelter. I'd say it's pragmatic because it's not something special with Dasein. As I said when I talked about it before, even beavers can build shelters and have equipmental, a minimal kind of equipmental totality for doing it. In that sense, I think it's ontic. I mean, if beavers can do it and we can do it, it doesn't seem to have anything especially ontological about it. It's just where this chain of purposes ends satisfying some need of Dasein or some desire of Dasein, some purpose of Dasein's. It's very just sensible. And now comes the tricky one, and that's at the starting about 10 lines from the end of the big paragraph on the right. But the totality of involvements itself goes back ultimately towards in which there is no further involvement. See, that's still ambiguous. There are two towards whiches for which there's no further involvement, namely shelter, and now we're going to go to being a shelterer. And that's, both of them are, so to speak, the end of a line. That's what I wasn't clear about, but they're end of two different lines, so to speak. They're not all on one line. So we go back to a towards which in which there's no further involvement. Good, that's true, all right, for both of them. This towards which is not an entity with the kind of being that belongs to what is ready to hand within the world. It's rather an entity. And now he's going to tell you, he's telling you this whole quote, just so you know, this is not the pragmatic story. Put this under significance in your column. This is the existential story. This is not the ontic one, but the ontological one. So now let me go on. It's a being. It's the end of the line in this ontological sense, where beavers are not qualified. It is rather an entity whose being is defined as being in the world and whose state of being worldhood itself belongs. This primary toward which, you can underline that. I mean, that's the difference between that and the just end of the line towards which. The primary towards which is not just another towards this as something which as something in which another involvement is possible. The primary towards which is the for the sake of which, and now we've got this different German word, Worum Willen. But the for the sake of, and the but's sort of funny, because he's not contradicting it, he's explaining it. The for the sake of always pertains to the being of Dasein. Now, I never noticed, and boy is Heidegger not helping, the difference between a possibility of Dasein's being, that's like being sheltered, something Dasein needs, and you can get it, and the being of Dasein. That's like being a shelterer. That's an identity. Heidegger's making this big distinction with these little moves, these two slightly different German words, these two slightly different formulations. That's why I missed it all these years. Okay, so the for the sake of pertains to the being of Dasein. That's in the ontological column, of course, for which in its being, that very being is essentially an issue. We've thus indicated the interconnection of the structure of how the interconnection by which the structure of an involvement leads to Dasein's very being, the sole authentic for the sake of which. That hasn't got to do with being authentic or inauthentic. That's not this kind of moral thing. That means the ultimate for the sake of which, the one that without which the whole thing wouldn't make any sense. And that's at the end of the line there. And that gets me to talking about significance. That, remember, one column was referential totality. That's the ontic one. That's the pragmatic one. And that's the mere for the sake of which. And then there's this other column which gets you to this ultimate, authentic, final for the sake of which. And that's in the column called significance. Now we can see what the difference between the referential totality or the totality of involvements. I think those are just sort of two ways of describing the same thing. The referential totality is the totality of things that bear on other things. That's their involvement. But there's a big difference between that and significance. Think about the beaver again. I mean, that's only beaver level connections. And then there's this other level. Why, sort of ultimately, do we bother to teach? Do I bother to teach Heidegger, or do people bother to make shelters? Beavers bother to make shelters because they're programmed to do it, maybe because they feel too cold and alone if they don't do it. But that's not enough to give this activity a kind of point of a different sort. The point that finally connects it all up with meaning is that you do it because it's the way you take a stand on your being. That's and significance, just let me say it clearly, the referential totality or the totality of involvement, which is the same thing, gets one more interesting characteristic, namely if you add, so how about putting it, I'm trying to put it as clearly as I can. The referential totality already has a kind of pragmatic for the sake of which is in a certain way why you're doing it, to teach the course, to make a shelter. But then you add something totally different, why it belongs to the very being of Dasein to be doing it. And that's up to Dasein, and that's the ultimate for the sake of which. Now, and that gives the point to the activity. And significance is the same activity in the same world of stuff described now as always having a point, namely what connects up with Dasein's understanding of itself, its identity. And another way to put the point is, there are two ways you could even put it in a column. People need shelter, and beavers need shelter and so forth, but people, and they need this equipment told to get that stuff they pragmatically need. That people need to take a stand on their being. And they need all that stuff to satisfy what they existentially need. In Heidegger jargon, that's what they need to exist, because existing just is taking a stand on your being. Okay, now I've explained that for the first time to me, I hope you all, and I feel happy about that, because I think that really gets something clear. Yeah? I think I understand your question. I have a little trouble hearing you. There's sort of background noise here, but yes, say it again louder so I can repeat.
Does it follow from the fact that ultimate for the sake of which is not part of the referential totality, that it cannot close itself as present to
I still understand it. Well, let me answer you. I mean, because it seems so interestingly wrong-headed what you're asking. I mean, significance is exactly what you have to add to the referential totality so that you get disclosing of the world. Now, that's important, and that's what you're sort of not saying, because I didn't say it, and it's good to make me say it. It's when you finally get all that up at the ontological level that it doesn't disclose the world to beavers when they make their hutch, but when human beings, all differently, but each one on their own, is doing something that is their stand on their being, that gives you this interconnected world where everything in it has a point or a significance, or not everything, a lot of stuff. I mean, maybe washing your hands doesn't, or brushing your teeth, but I mean, where important things show up, are disclosed, or there's a space in which things are disclosed, and significant things are discovered. Remember that. And now, I don't know why you brought in the present at hand, but I will see if I can answer that. Just a second, then you tell me if I have. Whatever is the space in which things are disclosed, various different modes of being are disclosed. That's just the way it happens to work. The structure of things is such that in order to have a referential whole, you've got to have two something or others. You've got to have something that has a bunch of properties that make it able to be useful for something, and you have to have a use for it. So there has to be this shank and blob that are hard and can be grasped and wielded around, and there has to be not just hammers, but nails and wood and walls and houses, and that's the ready to hand now. So there has to be the present at hand stuff with its properties, which in a certain sense underlies the ready to hand. We talked about that already, as the causal properties that make possible its use. And then there's the use. Now, why do you say the things you say? Is more or is less referential? Well, that's not the way Heidegger uses the term. I mean, there's plenty of causal holism in the way the stuff out of which hammers are made is related to the stuff out of which other things are made. But referential is not very helpful, but maybe bearing is better. Hammers have a bearing on nails. That's not present at hand. Science has no place for the bearing of hammers on nails. That doesn't affect science that if you had a culture in which everything was tied to vines, there wouldn't be anything like hammers. That's all already at the meaning level. I think you're pushing me to say something that I find sort of messes up my picture a little. It looks like you only need the referential totality to have ready to hand and present at hand revealed, disclosed. I can't make a case. Here's a puzzle for you who are sophisticated enough on this already. Most of you, I think it's too hard. I think I don't know the answer. Why is it that the disclosive space in which the ready to hand and the present at hand, in which equipment, both in its ready to hand and present at hand aspects, show up, why does that disclosive space require significance? Why isn't it enough that it just be a referential whole? Which is really the tough question. Don't beavers also have present at hand and ready to hand? They probably have ready to hand, but not present at hand. I take it beavers don't stare at substances and study their properties, but they certainly, I think, use mud and all the stuff that whatever beavers use transparently, and I think its way of being ought to be ready to hand. But so now I'm really confused about something, which I try to not confuse you about, but just state as a clear question. Somehow the holism of the referential whole, the whole of involvements, which is very much the same, and significance all give you worldhood which is the disclosive space in which anything with any kind of being gets discovered, why do we need, this is my question, this being that takes a stand on its being at the end of the line to give us worldhood? We better understand that, because that must be very important to Heidegger. I mean, that's what does separate Dasein from beavers, and I think that must be extremely important. David, can you help? Yeah.
I think it's just, isn't it just that unless there's an ultimate for the sake of which, functioning as the conditions for any other type of meaning, there would be no other meaning. I mean, why are you in this course lecturing and so forth, teach Heidegger, but why are we taking Heidegger and so forth? Ultimately, it comes down to we're interested in Dasein becomes an issue for us, a question for us. I mean, that's the ultimate context in which we're sitting in this class.
Well,
you eliminate the context, and you've eliminated the condition in which all the other referential wholes are not.
Okay, well, that's exactly what Heidegger thinks. But I'm questioning it. I mean, I want to know why Heidegger thinks that. Why doesn't Heidegger just think as soon as you've got a referential whole, you've got already tables and chairs and so forth? Why do I have to be here taking a stand on my being as a teacher? Why can't I just be earning my salary as a professor? And all this equipment will still show up for me.
That's just because that's the way Dasein is, right? I mean,
okay, that's the way Dasein is.
The beginning point of the
Okay, well then I see why you're saying it your way. So Heidegger may not have an argument that you need the referential, the significance level in order to have an organized world of equipment. But in fact, we do have the significance level, and it goes into the referential whole of significance. I can't help feeling that there's something deeper going on, that you can't disclose a world if you don't have that. And where I can't doesn't mean you just don't disclose a world unless you're taking a stand on your own being. That there's some deep connection between taking a stand on your own being and significance, and some deep connection between significance and disclosing a world that just a referential whole won't get. It would be nice to see that, because I think Heidegger sees it, but I don't see it. Yeah, Curtis.
Well, Heidegger starts to develop the idea that Dasein is the clearing.
Yeah.
Dasein is the space.
Dasein is its world existingly, yeah.
What makes the world able to show up.
Yes.
For the world showing up.
Yes.
And so the condition for disclosing rests.
Well, you guys...
Understanding Dasein's being, basically.
You guys are all good Heideggerians in a way, but you're stuck in the circle. I mean, you just said that Dasein is the being that takes a stand on its being, and lo and behold, that's how come there's a world showing up. I mean, yes, Dasein is its world existingly. That means Dasein takes a stand on its being, and lo and behold, there's a world disclosing things.
He supports the argument with his discussion of understanding.
Really?
Yeah, I think this is making clear what he means by Dasein is the clearing, is when he describes understanding.
Well, okay, you'll have to explain that to me later when we get to understanding. I don't see it. I don't see how it works. And I bet something important is in there. Well, come and tell me about it in office hours or wherever. Yeah.
Oh, well, this may be too much of a stretch, but in an effort to escape Heidegger's own terminology, I find myself reminded of William's idea of integrity regarding all this. And the idea, for example, like this ultimate for the sake of which, that you have your projects and commitments, but it's not the projects and commitments themselves that matter as much as that you have them, and that you're becoming a person by having them, that it's important to have them. And this sense in which everything else must be understood in context of that you just have this integrity, that you defend it inherently.
Well, that's. I think you're talking about William James, I take it. What James? I mean, Williams, Bernard Williams.
Yes, I believe so.
Bernard Williams, the man who was here, used to be here. Well, you don't know that because he died 2 years ago. But anyway, so why do you said Williams?
Yes, and I bring that up just to try and, I guess, defend this ultimate for the sake of which from a, I guess, more personal standpoint, to try and make it seem less abstract, in the sense that the reason it's important, I think, is because, my goodness.
something like it has to be this whole world of all these connections just wouldn't be there and wouldn't hang together if we weren't the kind of beings who have this kind of integrity or identity which we need to take a stand, that all of this stuff is here. See, this is the because I can't really understand yet. All of this stuff is here because we're the kind of being that needs to take a stand on its being. Heidegger says that, and I'm sure it's right, and I'm sure there's more to say about it, but we haven't got it yet. Yeah.
I just wonder if this is how most people actually live. Like, this is how we live in the sense that we're privileged enough to go to university and choose what we want to study and choose what work we want to go into. And we are very much creating ourselves and how we exist in the world and being in the world, creating spaces for a possibility of being in the world. But I wonder if most people actually live like that. I wonder if most people actually say, okay, well, I'm going to work today because I want to have this being in the world 10 years down the line or whatever.
Wait. Most people in all over the world or in the West, or I'm just wondering whether you're making which point you're making, that this is only for us because we're this kind of self-choosing culture. If so, I disagree with you completely. If that's because you're mistaking, and it's Heidegger's fault, choosing your stand on your being with having a stand on your being. In other cultures, you grow up as the medicine man because your father was, and you're in the chain of being medicine men. And other people grow up as workers and the mothers and weavers and whatever, and they never take a stand on their being consciously, but they have it, and it organizes what equipment they deal with and what it means to them. And now you may be saying also, even in our West world, lots of people don't ever face up to choosing, and again, choosing is the misleading thing, a stand on a being. But if Heidegger's right, they aren't Dasein, and they're not being in a world, and they don't disclose unless they do it. Everybody, the end of the line, is that being for which being is an issue. And we are all those beings, and in every culture. And so far as Heidegger's got it right about what it is to have a world, everyone that isn't a wolf child or a sort of catatonic has it. Yeah.
Well, but if it's not explicit and if it's not conscious, or even if it's like an unconscious thing you said again, like you said, then how is that any different than the being that just carry on the culture of his being?
A big, good question. You see, podcast people, you should be here. This is an interesting discussion. And people are making progress. Anyway, I think the answer to that is, one, we don't want to say it's unconscious. That would suggest that there is some sort of explicit choice being made, only it's just not, that they just don't know it. It's not like that. You look at people's behavior and you interpret it as, more like a therapist might. But, well, that only will bring back the unconscious. A good therapist. A therapist who doesn't believe in the unconscious. My kind of therapist. Anyway, that kind of therapist, I would say, knows that they're interpreting the behavior of the person, and they're watching and they're seeing, for instance, let's go back to the sacrificial mother. What do they see? Well, they see what she does with her children and her husband and her job, and they see what choices she makes and how it's always the children causing her to give up other things. Now, that doesn't mean that she's consciously decided to be a sacrificial mother, and it's sort of misleading to say unconsciously decided, as if some other part of her brain has decided. It just wasn't something she had access to. She just grows up with a style of behavior which somebody with sensitivity in that kind of training, observing it, sees that that's really her identity. That's what really matters to her. And that's in that. If you keep putting it that way, you can then, because you need to, because you've got to be able to see why Heidegger thinks that everybody, even the most sort of lazy people, or the most conformist people, or the most primitive people in some other culture, if you observe their behavior, you'll see that there's some way that they are, that something crucial is in there, something for which they will sort of give up everything else if they have to. But that was helpful, yeah.
But wouldn't that be art categorizing them instead of that being there?
Well, those are all good questions. I think the nature of a interpretation, in Heidegger fancy talk, hermeneutic investigation, is that you make an interpretation You try to see if all the details fit in. If crucial details that are obviously important to the person don't fit in, then you've got to give up that interpretation and get a better one. And that's how it works. The same way it works with reading Being in Time. You come up with that's hermeneutic too. Everything, all over the place in Heidegger, it's interpretation that's going on. In Heidegger, you look at the text, you try to make sense of it, you say, I see, this is the phenomenon he's talking about, and you describe that, and you go back and you look at the text, and that seems to make sense for a while, and then some important sentence comes along that shows you that wasn't right, and you have to try again, and you never know you've got the answer. It's interesting that Heidegger is so consistent. Did I read you the passage from Basic Problems where Heidegger says that he knows that he may not, he knows that he hasn't got it. In some crucial way, he hasn't got it right. And he knows that because it's an interpretation that he's giving. An interpretation is always in a horizon, that is a context, a background of what you're taking for granted as familiar. And there's always, Heidegger thinks, a broader context in which your context, which you thought was everything, turns out not to be. So your interpretation, you never come to the final interpretation. Sometimes Heidegger thinks. In Basic Problems, that's what he thinks. In Being in Time, he seems to think that when you get to temporality, you really get to the ultimate interpretation. I think Heidegger is deeply ambivalent about that. But we don't need to say that. Go into that. Let's go back to the main line. Yeah.
Well, does disclosing a world mean to disclose a world as a world, like to reveal a world in itself? Or is it something more before you did?
Good. Her question, does disclosing a world meaning disclosing it as a world? That is, you realize that you're disclosing a world and that a world is what you're disclosing. No, you don't have to do that. I mean, always test this against the Black Forest peasants, who are Heidegger's favorite form of human being. And presumably they haven't a clue about world disclosing. That doesn't mean that there isn't a world open to them in which objects are showing up as present at hand and ready to hand. Okay. Yeah. Wait, no, let me, before you go talking again, let's hear from Tyler back there. Can you talk real loud?
Two questions, I guess. Two passages come to mind. One of them is from the Basic Problems, where there he nicely separates the referential whole from significance.
From significance. Good.
And talks about needing to think through each part separately in order to think through the transcendental preconditions of the encounter.
That seems like, so far, just words. And what's the phenomena that he's asking us to look at? Whoa, wait, some big noise is coming.
The phenomena I want to point to is, I think we stumbled on the last when we were staring at this passage and asking about being towards the world. I think it was fun to be transcendental.
I think being toward the world, I mean, I have trouble hearing you, but I think people should, Heidegger does say being towards the world, but I think it's very misleading. I can't, give me the page references, because that sounds so wrong to me, that there could be a being towards the world for a being that is always already in the world seems to me crazy. I mean, the crucial thing about Dasein is you're never outside the world. You're never related to the world. There's too much in it, like a goldfish in water. The goldfish isn't towards the water. I mean, how could you be towards the world when you are the world existingly? So you have to see the passages.
The picture I want is something like, you can imagine Dasein in a referential whole, with coping with things pragmatically. But what he seems to be insisting is that's not enough. There has to be something like being towards concern or care or significance, which I don't, maybe not prior, but it's both my motive.
Well, that's just to say, it seems to me, what you just said seems to me right, but that's to repeat the point. Yes, somehow or other, there has to be something, namely taking a stand on your being, which has to be in there. Otherwise, you wouldn't be being in the world. In fact, this very sentence says that, doesn't it? Or some sentence lately, just about the primer for the sake of percentage to the being of Dasein. No, not that sense. But anyway, we know Dasein is being in the world, and we know that being in the world requires taking a stand on your being. So that's fine. The question is, and we know you're always already in the world, and you're always already in the world the way human beings are in the world. Namely, it's serving you as a equipment, practically, the world and the referential totality, to do something which is your stand on your being. That's what Heidegger says. That's the phenomena. I agree with that, but I don't see yet that nothing I want to say denies that. I just don't, and maybe there's no need to say anything more. Maybe what my problem is to ask for something more. Anyway, I can't handle that more. So now I have one more hand up. You wanted to come. Oh no, you okay? Yes. Wow. That's a good, important question, but it's a kind of, it's a therapy kind of question, not really for us to think about. On my website, if you want to follow it up, there's a paper called Two Alternative Conceptions of Psychotherapy, in which the one is that there's some unconscious stuff, facts, beliefs, memories that you should get out of your unconscious, and the other is what the unconscious really is the background. It's the water. And that's what you're saying. I mean, the sacrificial mother. Of course, she doesn't know she's a sacrificial mother. It's not a truth that she's sort of repressing. It's so pervasive she can't see it. So what can the therapist do? Well, the therapist has got to gradually get her to see that what she takes as the obvious truth about reality is her interpretation, and it's getting her in trouble. But that's a hard thing to do, and Tran, for instance, got to play a role in it, because she's going to be relating to the therapist in a way that he can or she can grab something that isn't her usual way. But anyway, I don't want to go into it more, but your question is a good one. The sacrificial mother does not know that she's a sacrificial mother, and probably whatever I'm doing when I keep saying I'm a teacher is something that I don't really know. I can use this to make a point. It isn't as if, and I just talk this way because it's simpler, that I've got my for the sake of which it's being a teacher, the guy building the house has got his for the sake of which it's being a shelterer. It's much more specific than that. I'm just not any old teacher, but a teacher with a certain style, teaching at a certain stage in the history of the world, teaching in a whole academic system, teaching Heidegger. I mean, it's very, very specific, my for the sake of which. It's sort of my identity, and my identity isn't some very general role. But you can sort of point at it that way. And of course, the sacrificial mother will have her own very special way, and you can think of that as an atmosphere that will color everything that I experience, or she experiences, or you experience. And okay, now I think we should go on. That's all fascinating, and I knew that I had gotten into some new territory, which is which one out to do every once in a while. Now, oddly enough, I have a quote that I was going to read next. We were talking about worldhood. We're talking about significance, referential totality plus significance equals worldhood. And worldhood is this disclosive space in which we encounter everything. And it's come up sort of in passing and we know that worldhood is more basic than intentionality. That worldhood is what makes intentionality possible. It's not intentionality, that is our beliefs and our desires and stuff that relate us as a mind to the world, or that makes the worldhood possible. It's because there is this disclosive space that I can have beliefs, I can perceive things, I can desire things. Well, now, I just want to add one more thing, because I just came across an amazing quote. I knew it once before, but I lost it. Now I find it again. I just want to add that not only, And this is really mind-boggling, and that's why it's interesting. Now, Heidegger thinks not only does the world, or the phenomenon of world, whichever, make intentionality, that is, the relation of the mind and world to the world, possible, he thinks it makes consciousness possible. I say this because people constantly sort of bring in conscious and unconscious when they think about this, and that's really just not interesting to Heidegger. And I say it, too, because those of you who are philosophy majors, and most of you are, know that consciousness is a hot subject right now. There are meetings all the time, all over the world, and books and anthologies of people writing about consciousness. I think, and they all say there's a very big problem, and it sure is. I think nobody has a clue as to what it is or how to talk about it or how it's related to the brain. But Heidegger has an interesting spin on this. His answer would be, well, then don't talk about it. Don't worry about it. It's not important anyway. And I'll just read you the quote where he says that, and I'll print it on the next thing I hand out because it's in a very obscure place. It's in a little book called Existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, edited or put together by Walter Kaufmann. It's translated from something Heidegger wrote called The Way Back into the Ground of Metaphysics. But don't worry about all that. I put that on when I give you the quote. Here's the quote. The existential nature of man is the reason why man can represent things as such and why he can be conscious of them. All consciousness presupposes existence as the essence of man. He's saying man instead of Dasein this time. He sometimes does that. So I'll just put in Dasein. Better anyway that way. So let's go back to that. Starting over. The existential nature of Dasein is the reason why Dasein can represent beings as such and why Dasein can be conscious of them. All consciousness presupposes existence as the essence of Dasein. You recognize being in time. Consciousness does not itself create the openness of beings. That's the disclosing of world. Nor is it consciousness that makes it possible for man to stand open for beings. That's the same point. Whither and whence and in what free dimension could the intentionality of consciousness move if being in the world were not the essence of man in the first place? So Heidegger's notion is the kind of coping, the kind of absorbed coping we do at the most basic level, where we don't even have to be conscious, already, and we do that with the referential totality of significance. That basic level, which is the level of the world and of disclosing, is prior to consciousness. It doesn't need consciousness. That's an amazing claim. I mean, I think it's right. Nietzsche had a similar story to tell. But it certainly seems like a sort of odd thing to spend so much time on it, as if, but everybody believes it because you're all Cartesians at heart, me too. I mean, it looks like if you're not conscious, well, then there isn't any world, there isn't any referential totality. How can you disclose any objects? Got to be conscious, otherwise you're just in a stupor, or you're a zombie, John Searle says, I hold, and that Heidegger holds. But you're not a sleepwalking zombie. You're coping very with great skill and flexibility and expertise with the door and the doorknob and the chairs and the English language as you carry on a conversation. And you can do it without being in any. I mean, consciousness is such a weaselly word. You can certainly do it without noticing what you're doing. You can do it in such an absorbed way that you are just not aware of what you're doing. But you do it very well anyway. And then you can later reflect on it. And of course, one more thing I want to say. Heidegger doesn't think that means that you're never conscious. He just thinks that at the very rock bottom, most finding your way around in the world, as Dewey says, sort of getting on and off the bus and dressing yourself, you can do that without being conscious of what you're doing. Anyway, so interesting quote, I think. Now, let's go on to where we are, the critique of Descartes. Luckily, we have another whole session, so I'm not worried. But I want to read one thing. Sometimes, and I'm still in a kind of getting everything located in my head in a way. I mean, I know that Heidegger is it has a big influence on people who take this course. And they say it changes their life and it changes their way of looking at things. And I must say, like the sacrificial mother, I'm so inside it that I don't really understand what they're talking about. So, but every once in a while, I read somebody who clearly and simply sort of says why Heidegger is so important to the West and to them and to us. And this is Mark Rathall in his introduction to the How to Read Heidegger book. And it fits in right here with the Cartesian chapter. That's why I'm reading it now. It's very simple. He says, at the bottom of page 5, Heidegger did more than any other thinker of the 20th century to develop a coherent way of thinking and talking about human existence without reducing it to a natural scientific phenomenon on the one hand, or treating it as a ghostly mind haunting the physical world on the other. This has inspired artists and social scientists who have struggled to acknowledge the dignity and freedom of human existence. It has inspired scientists who have tried to keep mindful of the limits of scientific inquiry, and it has challenged us all to rethink our place in history and the direction in which we as a scientific and technological culture are moving. I think that's a neat summing up of why Heidegger is interesting. Did you put a hand up? No. And it brings to focus on the question of naturalism and of cognitivism, which is what I'm going to talk about from today and the next time. Naturalism is the view that we will eventually understand everything in terms of physics and chemistry. And there are these people who are worrying about how we're going to understand consciousness in terms of brain activity, since consciousness seems to be this kind of first-person awareness, and brain activity just seems to be neurons bumping into each other. So naturalism is a big issue, and Heidegger's an anti-naturalist. And cognitivism is a big issue. That's the ghostly mind story. That's John Searle kind of story. There's always got to be consciousness and meaning and intentionality, which, besides the brute facts of science. And then you get the question, well, can you, in the end, reduce the consciousness and this intentionality to the brute facts of science? Or are you going to be a dualist about it and say, well, there are these two deeply different ways of being, and you can't reduce one to the other? Those are all big issues that people are writing and thinking and having meetings and teaching courses about, and Heidegger's got an important, interesting view. So I'm going to sum up his view in 3 slogans. Naturalism is impossible, meaning we can't get a meaningful world from the brute facts of physics. Brute facts is Searle's way of talking about it, and I think it's very helpful. Searle is an interesting character who worries about this issue. So naturalism is impossible, Heidegger thinks. Cartesianism is impossible. Cartesianism says, well, of course you can't expect to get the meaning and mental stuff out of physical things. Why would you think so? You've got to throw in, that's what I said earlier a minute ago, you've got to throw in mind, this invisible super stuff. And only because there are minds in the world, as well as all this physical stuff, do we get a meaningful world. Now, Heidegger thinks that's that kind of dualism, which is Descartes, build a meaningful whole somehow out of physics, out of the physical and the mental. That's impossible. And he further thinks that something like artificial intelligence, or more generally cognitivism, which is a kind of funny form of Cartesianism, I'll explain when I get there, won't work. That is, you can't use mental elements to make a representation of the world in the mind and then generate behavior on the basis of that. Those of you who know about cognitivism and AI will recognize that that's sort of the general feature of what John Hoagland, a former student from here, calls good old-fashioned AI. But the crucial issue there is whether you have to have an inner representation of the external world. Okay, I'm not going to get to that today, so let's start with the anti-naturalism. Heidegger wants to show the contrast between his ontological understanding of the world and traditional ontology. Traditional ontology starts with this brute stuff, nature, and then asks, and what else do we have to add on to get our world? And different people have different views about it. But Heidegger is saying that whole way of asking the question is wrong. What's basic is the holistic coping, which opens up the world by beings like us who are already in it. And that's more basic than perceiving and thinking and looking at the present at hand. So, but I give you some quotes to show you. I mean, he's turning around a kind of naturalism that says that what's basic is the natural world and the present at hand, and he's saying no, that's not right. Okay, he does all this very well in the fundamental, in the, what is it? Something history of time, history of the concept of time, which I keep talking about because it's very. Remember, it's the lectures the year before being in time. So at the bottom of 164, he says, letting something be seen as possible on the basis of, where are we? On the basis of a letting something be encountered. And this is possible only on the basis of always already being involved with. Only an entity which in its being has the aptitude to let another entity be encountered stands in the possibility of apprehending something, of knowledge. Knowing is nothing but a mode of being in the world. Specifically, it's not even a primary, but a founded way of being in the world. That's what I wanted to get to. I mean, so the whole attitude of knowing, which is the traditional way that we're supposed to be related to nature, isn't going to be for him basic. Or he says, but you can see why I like this. Knowing is nothing but a mode of being in the world. Specifically, it's not even a primary, but a founded way of being in the world, a way which is always possible only on the basis of non-cognitive comportment. I mean, I like that because he's saying that the whole world, or the whole way of thinking about things as minds looking at objects, only makes sense on the background. It's the usual point of absorbed coping, of knowing your way around. I don't know now why I read that. I mean, except I like it. I don't see that it helps very much for the discussion right now. But here I'm going to go on where I am. When saying knowledge is a founded mode, Heidegger's saying that it is not what's most basic. What's most basic are the coping skills that add up to familiarity and open a world. And on the basis of that, we can then have theory and we can have practice, relate to particular things. And Heidegger and Descartes is just the opposite of that. That's why I want to set that up, because Descartes says it's on the basis of the stuff in the world that we have to do our ontology. And Heidegger's talking about this on 122, page 89 at the top, in the middle of that first paragraph. The paragraph, a contrast between our analysis of worldhood and Descartes' interpretation of worldhood. He says, we shall accordingly try to clarify his approach, that is, this approach, ontologically. No, that's the wrong approach, I'm sorry. He's going to try to clarify Descartes' approach. Yeah, this is how this whole paragraph is setting up how Descartes does it. So maybe I should begin at the beginning of section B. Only step by step, and you have to remember this is not Heidegger, can the concept of worldhood and the structures which this phenomenon embraces be firmly secured in the course of our investigation. The interpretation of the world begins in the first instance with some entity within the world. You can see that can't be Heidegger unless he was beginning with this entity. But I mean any old entity within the world. So that the phenomena of the world in general no longer comes into view. That is, you just pay attention to things, stuff, brute facts, and you lose track that there is a world at all. You could pay attention to the universe, because the universe is just a bunch of facts, but you lose the referential whole and all that. So he said, so now he's going to talk about that. We shall accordingly try to clarify this view, clarify this approach ontologically by considering what is perhaps the most extreme form in which it's been carried out. We not only shall present briefly the basic features of Descartes' ontology of the quotes world, because Descartes doesn't really know that there's a Heidegger kind of world. Remember, the quotes world is the universe. It's the totality of facts. We not only shall present briefly the basic features of Descartes' ontology of the world, but shall inquire into its presuppositions and characterize these in the light of what we've hitherto achieved. So he's going to sort of test Descartes against his phenomenology. And he says it again on 199. Again, I think, well, I was having a feeling, boy, oh boy, the things are good in this book, and maybe I got carried away. But on 199, he says, worldhood cannot be read off from nature. The environmental references in which nature is present primarily in a worldly way tell us rather the reverse. Nature as a reality can only be understood on the basis of worldhood. Remember, not explained. Heidegger's always got in the background a distinction between explaining things, like why this lectern holds the papers up. That's science's job. And understanding things, which is understanding the significance of them. So he wants to say, nature can only be understood on the basis of worldhood. The entative relationships of dependence of worldly entities among themselves do not coincide with the founding relationships in being. That is, what founding relationships are relationships of what makes sense of what, whereas causal relationships explain what causes what. And so, and now another way to put what he's trying to set up here is that he wants you to see that the nature is what you've got left when intelligibility, that is significance, and everything that makes sense of our way of being is left out. Then you get this very reduced and thinned out bunch of facts that are present at hand with meaningless present at hand properties. And his claim is you can't explain this world, the in order to, towards which, and obviously the for the sake of which, and significance, you can't explain that if all you've got to go on. You can't understand it or explain it. Which do I mean? I underline explain. Well, You want to, the people who want to explain all this mean they want to take these minimal facts and then add them up to somehow show that you could start with these brute facts and you end up with a world that. And remember now, this is not Descartes really. This is naturalism. Descartes' going to say, yeah, I know you can't do that, but you have to throw in mind. But right now, he's just telling you that a lot is left out when you try to do any kind of explanation or understanding. I'm not being clear because Heidegger's not doing what I'm not quite in sync with what Heidegger's doing. Heidegger thinks naturalism is just the business of trying to explain everything causally, and eventually you won't need to bring in minds or functions or world or equipment or anything like that. And that's the view he's going to criticize first. But, all this is more confusing than I realized. But, yeah.
But you also have to take, Heidegger also wants to explain the possibility of a theoretical attitude toward.
Yes, and just what I was going to say next. That's right. You can have a theoretical attitude, and then you can try to explain everything. And You can explain it, but you can't understand it. That is, it's right. Descartes, this is the way you think about it. Descartes was right trying to find the basic brute stuff that would explain how there were everything. I mean, how there were stars and how there was hearts pumping blood, and he found out that there were how the light rays that hit the eye were conducted by the optical fiber to the brain, and he was busy explaining all sorts of things. And Heidegger thinks that's good. That's what David wants me to say. I mean, it's all right. I mean, it's important to take a theoretical attitude and give a story about the causal way all of these various bits of matter interact. And Descartes, given when he was writing, did a brilliant job. I want to say this because almost everybody who reads this thinks that Heidegger is criticizing Descartes for trying to do science, modern science. And he's not. So I'm going to read you two places just so we can be sure that we all agree about that. Science, I think Heidegger wants to say, though it can't explain all this in order to significance and stuff, because that isn't explainable. That's only understandable. That is, you can make it intelligible, but you can't give a causal story about it. Science can give an explanation of every objective event. So on 134, he says, I hope, at the end of that first section, middle of the page, 101 in the German, within certain limits, the analysis of the extensio remains independent of his, meaning Descartes, neglecting to provide an explicit interpretation for the being of extended entities. That is, Heidegger's only got one understanding of being. I'm surprised I didn't read it, which is substance, of course. I'll read it in a second. So, but did I say Heidegger? Descartes only understands substances with their properties. Extended stuff out there, that's his, everything is made up of little bits of space for Descartes. Extended stuff out there with its properties to form vortices and bump into each other. It's not Newtonian yet, but he's doing his best. And the other substance, namely the mind, with its properties, namely having ideas and desires and beliefs in it. If you've got this substance view, you can't explain where you got it, and you can't use it to understand anything. However, there is some phenomenal justification for regarding the extensio as a basic characteristic of the world, within quotes, even if by recourse to this, neither the spatiality of the world nor the entities we encounter in our environment, nor even Dasein itself can be conceived ontologically. Now, when we get to the space chapter, just so this doesn't seem very surprising, you can get near, far, between, all that kind of space out of Descartes. But what you can't get is what? Well, you can't get here. There's no here in Descartes' space world. It's a world seen from nowhere. Whereas our space, there is a here in which things are near and far and up and down and so forth. We'll get to the space chapter. But what I want you to get out of it right now is when Descartes thinks about the extensio, he's got something right about space, though there's a kind of existential space, namely the kind of space that we live in, that he can't get, because he's got it right about the galaxies. Of course, right in that he doesn't have any quarks and strings, but he's got the right approach, Heidegger thinks. And another place where he says it even better, 184 of the History of the Concept of Time. So here's how, so keep in the I don't want to lose you. Keep in the back of your mind. The criticism he's going to make of Descartes is you can't use the extensia, the bits of matter, the brute facts that you use to explain everything that happens in the objective world to explain or make any sense of what's going on in our human world. I said world one the first time, I should have said universe. You can use this to explain what's going on in the universe, but you can't use what Descartes' res extensa to understand what's going on in our world. So here's something a lot like that on 184, bottom of the page. The course of the scientific inquiry into reality shows that the original mode of encounter of an environing world is always already given up in favor of the established view of the world as the reality of nature, so that we may interpret the specific phenomena of the world in terms of its theoretical knowledge of the objectivity of nature. Now, he agrees. We have to give up all our involvement and look at the world differently, scientifically, objectively, theoretically. But then you can explain lots, and you can really talk about it. There is theoretical knowledge of objective nature. I'm going to read more. If we consider this work of Descartes in relation to the constitution of the mathematical sciences of nature and to the elaboration of mathematical physics in particular, these considerations then naturally assume a fundamentally positive significance. I wouldn't go into that if it wasn't so important to see that Heidegger, again, as I say, has nothing against science, and he has nothing against Descartes as the founder of contemporary mathematical physics. And that's not his problem. His problem is that Descartes can't explain our world because he's only got these two substances. So let me go on. So a lot is left out if you do that. If you give an objective description and theoretical description of the universe. He says on 168 in the History of the Concept of Time, the more the initially experienced world is deprived of worldhood, unworlded, as we will later put it, that is, the more the initially experienced world becomes mere nature, the more we discover in its mere naturality, and that is, we discover the objectivity of physics. I'm making the same point again and again. Fine, you could leave out a whole lot of stuff, and then you can have physics, but he's an anti-naturalist because he wants to say but, and I want to read you one more before somebody else reads anything. The punchline that I'm trying to set you up for here is on 94 of Being in Time. This is the sort of anti-naturalist slogan. Second sentence on 94, on 65 of the German. Only in some definite mode of its own being in the world can Dasein discover entities as nature. This manner of knowing them has the character of depriving the world of its worldhood in a definite way. I've just been talking about that. Nature, as the categorical aggregate of those structures of being which a definite entity encountered within the world may possess, can never make worldhood intelligible. I said the slogan was, naturalism is impossible, and that's the statement of it. You have to leave out so much of world and worldhood in order to get to the pure res extensa, the pure bits of matter, the brute facts, and you can't get back all that meaning that you left out. That's Heidegger's big insight. Let's see if I can say it. I got one more chance to say it, then I will stop. That means that we can't understand this whole of meaning, even if we can give a causal account that explains everything under the description of matter in motion. I think I asked, how many know Davidson's stuff, anomalous monism? This is a kind of anomalous monism claim, but for those who know it, science can explain everything that you can describe as basic stuff moving around, but that doesn't enable it to describe it all, and that's kind of holism of energy and fields and stuff. But there's no way that holism gets any grip on the holism of referential totality and significance. here's how I wrote it. The natural kinds, like electrons, can explain why some material objects are hard and others are floppy or soft. But they can't explain the class of things in the world that are hammers, because that's correlated with being a hammer, and it's correlated with all of our interests, and it's a different holism. They just have no way of relating to each other. Yeah. What was that? The last thing I read? But I was reading on 169 last in oh, yeah, that's right, 169. Let me see if I want to say. Okay, now I just got 2 minutes, but that's fine. Where are we? Well, that's the story very quickly, that science is fine, but naturalism is impossible. That is, science is fine for explaining the universe and its physical properties, but it cannot understand the world and its meaning relations. Now, that's the first move. Remember the second move, and that's why I was confusing you and confusing me. Descartes doesn't make this mistake. Okay? Descartes is not a naturalist. Descartes doesn't claim that the res extensa explains meaning. Then, because there's the res cogitans, the thinking thing, the mind. So now we get to dualism. Okay, we're going to grant that we're not going to be naturalists. You can't just say science is eventually going to explain everything. You've got to say something about how all this meaning gets here. And Descartes' move is to say, and it's perfectly like Husserl and like Searle, I'll read you a little bit of Husserl next time, that is, well, then the mind has got to put in the meaning. It's another self-sufficient substance besides the bits of matter, the brute facts. That self-sufficient substance is going to put function predicates on these brute facts, and then we'll get the whole world of meaning. That's the second claim. And that turns out to what it doesn't work. That's impossible, too. We'll start with the arguments why that's impossible next time.